each time I enter these spaces. So I'm grateful to be here with each of you. And I thank you for holding space. And as we get started, I just want to, invite us to check in with ourselves. If you're an educator, you may have seen a sort of diagram that looks like a series of circles. And there is a zone, there's 3 zones. And one is called the panic zone. One is called the comfort zone. And those are like on the opposite ends of the spectrum. And somewhere in the middle is the learning zone. So the space where we're actually able to engage and think in nuanced ways and embrace ideas maybe that we're not as familiar with. And so one of the reasons that I want to invite us to check in with ourselves, how we're doing, is that it's helpful before a conversation where we hope to learn not only facts about harm and a trauma, but also to learn about ourselves and each other, to know where we're at, how we're coming into this space. So I just invite you to check in with yourself, not just intellectually, but where are you at? Maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, and you're welcome to type in the chat if you'd like to share with the group. But I'll invite you to take a few breaths and just check in with yourself physically, spiritually, emotionally. How are you right now? I think I'm coming into the space this morning probably at around a 6 or 7. I'm really grateful for the chance to be with each of you. I'm also a little worried about my voice. And there's a certain level of discomfort that I have around opening this kind of conversation in a space where there's names on the screen that say something like speech to text, and I don't know who that is. And some of that discomfort comes from a recognition that I carry with me, that these conversations are not always welcome in church contexts. And so I recognized in myself this morning, even as I sat down to kind of whittle down and narrow down what I would talk about, I noticed, wow, there's a bit of trembling in my body as I prepare to enter this conversation. And so I want to acknowledge that, because in a way we can't, well, we'll get to that later, but we can't really engage in open listening or holding space for nuance when our bodies are in a heightened threat response. And so that's part of the reason why I invite this awareness as we get started. I'm going to take quite a personal approach to this conversation today. And so I will start by simply telling you a little bit of backstory. My training is in Hebrew Bible and in the languages and cultures of the world of the Bible. So at UCLA during my PhD studies, I took probably 7 quarters of Akkadian. I was like really enjoying learning how to read the little triangles on cuneiform blocks and just learning all these elements of the world out of which the Bible arose over the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years that were part of that process. And you could say I went to UCLA, but we lived about 70 miles to the north in the Mojave Desert. And so it was a bit of a sacrifice for me personally to go to grad school. And I remember as I would get up at 3 a.m., get on the bus at 4, and then, commute this long distance through traffic and go back and forth day after day, I remember thinking, like, why am I doing this? And one of the answers to that question was that I had a dream job, and that was to be in the classroom with students engaging with the Hebrew Bible. Like that was my dream. And I would hold this little, I don't know if you can see this, but a little keychain that I received from the Walla Walla University Alumni Association on the day that I graduated. I would hold that and I would say, you know what, people can do hard things for a period of time when there's a goal at the other end. And so that goal was to teach, and to specifically to teach Hebrew Bible. And so if I were to ask myself, what is it that I like that was so compelling, right? That would make me want to sacrifice to meet that goal. And I would say that it is in moments of engaging around the text with students, it is in those moments that I feel most alive. And what I find most invigorating about this is the process, like the back and forth with the students, the unpredictable nature of the interaction, the fact that I can't predict, right? Every group is its own sort of being, and that larger being is made up of all of the stories, right? Each student in the room creates this larger being that is that classroom. And it's their stories and experiences, right? The things that they're despairing about, their hopes and dreams, the pain that they carry, their skill sets, their resources, all these things form that space. And I find this absolutely life-giving, invigorating to be in that space, because it's a dynamic, growing, ongoing process. And I'm shaped by being in that space. And so I think that when I came from UCLA and I entered the classroom, I was in, for a couple of years, a phase where I was thinking still that my role was somehow to impart information, but to do it in a way that was as engaging as possible. So I was very fascinated with pedagogy, and I wanted to do interactive learning and all of that, but I still thought of my main role as giving information. And quarter by quarter, usually the first class period, but sometime in the first week of the class, each time I taught a Hebrew Bible literature class, I would ask the students a little about themselves, because, you know, we have within the same classroom often someone who's never even heard of Moses, and someone else who has really never been exposed to anything outside of the Bible and Ellen White. Okay. And those students are all sitting in the same classroom. And so each quarter I would try to kind of get a feel for where students were at, and I would try to adapt how I was approaching things. And one of the questions that I asked on this introductory questionnaire was something along the lines of, if you had to think about your earliest or most vivid memory of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, what would that be? And one of the things that I learned in reading over students' answers to that question, the first couple of years that I was here teaching at Walla Walla, was that there was a potential block in my classroom, a block to the kind of learning that I was hoping for, and that this barrier that was there in basically every classroom. So it was not an outlier. It was in every single group of students in one way or another. And it was a barrier that specifically would have put up a wall and made difficult, or maybe even impossible, the kind of dynamic conversational learning that I was wanting to facilitate. So let me just explain it. Let me just explain it this way. I started to see that there was a wound, and I don't know, I don't want to share specific stories, because I think that owning our own stories is one of the really important elements of trauma healing. But let me just say that in every single group of students that I was engaging with, I learned that there was at least one person who had had the Old Testament weaponized against them. And the types of wounds that this left were sometimes very raw and other times had scabbed over. You could say probably even those of us gathered here, we all have our own wounds. I mean, it was, as you pointed out before we even got started, just based on the title of today's presentation, we already started sharing stories in the chat, right? So if we imagine those of us here, we all carry wounds, and those wounds are at all different points, as far as being so raw that when something pushes them, it's excruciating, to being simply maybe it's scabbed over, or maybe some wounds are at the point where all that's left is a thickened kind of area of scar tissue. And that's probably true in many groups of people where there's a varied group. But if you think about, so let me share, before I go into the brain process explanation, let me just share a lyric from one of my favorite folk singers that kind of encapsulates what I started to realize. This is from Betty's Diner. It's a song written by Carrie Newcomer, and she talks about this little old diner and all the people that come and go, and kind of weaves their backstories into the lyrics of the song. And there are a couple of lines in there that really capture what I started to see in my classroom. You picture, the checkered tablecloth, ketchup, mustard, that is who knows how old, and some of those little salt packets, sugar packets. Like, picture yourself at a diner. And she says, in that room, the wants and wounds of the human race, despair and hope sit face to face. And so I started to realize that when I looked out at these groups of students, there were wounds mixed right in there with the wants, right? Just like there was a student sitting there who wanted to serve God with all their heart, soul, and mind. There was a student sitting there with such gaping wounds that even the word Bible, right, would put up a kind of a wall. And there were people in that room who were despairing, right? Who were wondering things like, can I be a Christian and not a perpetrator? Is that possible? Or do I have to choose one or the other? And so realizing this really made me realize that the work that I wanted to do was not automatically possible. So to say a little bit about this, I think that we could say trauma, just like spirituality, is in many ways universal, but it manifests uniquely for each person. So we could also say that there are as many experiences of trauma as there are people. I like how Dr. Gabor Mate talks about trauma, where he says, basically, trauma is not what happens to us, but it's what happens in us as a result of what happens to us. In resilience research, I've heard this spoken about as, you can have 3 people who encounter the same external situation or stimuli. And I think the analogy, some of you probably know this better than me, but I think the analogy goes something like, one is a shiny metal doll. So in other words, encountering the fire, so to speak, actually makes them shinier and more beautiful. One is a glass doll, right? And so encountering that sudden change in heat actually shatters it into a whole lot of pieces. And the other is more like what I would think of as pottery, right? Where it survives, but you can see the marks, or maybe we could think of a wooden figure. But the main takeaway in the field of trauma is to acknowledge that what happens is not the trauma necessarily. It's what happens in us as a result of what happens, and that can vary based on so many different factors. And so to think of trauma as universal in the sense of we have all, well, let me read a couple of definitions that I think can be helpful in this regard. Many people talk about trauma as fracturing. So a fracturing of self or one's relationship to the world. That's a common feature, whether you're talking about big T trauma, so to speak, which would be a discrete extreme event that causes wounds, or small t trauma, or what we might often link with CPTSD, complex PTSD, that is where the triggers, the responses that our body carries are tied to so many different stimuli because we soaked them in slowly over a long period of time, from a variety of avenues. And so if you think about the fracturing of self or one's relationship to the world, I like to think of it in terms of Old Testament. So I think of humans as being designed to be in unbroken relationship with ourselves, with other people, with the created world, and with the divine. And so whenever there's a fracturing in any of those relationships with ourselves, with other people, with the created world, or with the divine, that causes a sort of wound. And another person, Peter Levine, who's done a lot of work in somatics, he says that trauma is about a loss of connection to ourselves, our families, and the world around us. And so thinking of it that way, there is a sense in which it's universal. Every single person is going to encounter at some point in their life a fracturing of relationship. And how that heals, whether someone can integrate that into a whole and healing way of making sense of their life, is really dependent on a number of factors: internal resources, external resources. But I think that it's safe to say, despite a huge array of different types of experiences that people encounter, that all humans are going to encounter something that could potentially cause trauma, wounding, or harm. And so it's a common human experience, but it's also unique. It can manifest in so many different ways. And so what I realized in teaching students was that I was, in a way, hoping by means of creative pedagogy, active learning, I would have people stand up and engage, and I would spend hours writing really creative discussion questions, etc. But I was hoping by means of creative pedagogy to be able to make it so all of those students, with their varied experiences and stories and concerns, hopes, angsts, that they would all be able to engage with the Hebrew Bible literature in a way that would help them feel invited into the conversation. I wanted to invite students into the Bible, as an invitation for dialogue, to help them see how the texts were in conversation with each other, and how the issues changed as the contextual, socio-political situations changed. And it's impossible. That's frankly not possible. Our brains are built to take care of what is most important. And in some cases, our brains make that choice for us without consulting us. I shouldn't say in some. I would say in most situations, our brains make that choice for us without consulting us, in the sense of it's not within our conscious awareness. And so if I have students sitting in my classroom who have had the Hebrew Bible weaponized against them or the ones that they love, and then I'm asking them, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but I'm going to wiggle it around on the screen just in case. I'm asking them to engage this part of the brain when they could very well have they could very well be in a state that some people call amygdala hijack, where our body gets a threat response and then suddenly this part of our brain is activated. Okay, so our brain is always helping us or automatically prioritizing certain things like our heartbeat, our breath, these kinds of things that we don't really have to think about. But our brain makes sure that our bodies keep doing it, right, to prioritize our survival. But if someone sitting in my classroom has had the text weaponized against them, and then I'm asking them to do things like, let's look at the 40 different layers of symbolism in the metaphor of God is a rock. Or I'm asking them to think about, why would it be that when your entire world has collapsed and the temple where you thought God dwelt has been burned to the ground and the gold has been melted down and taken by your enemies, why would it be that suddenly people become far more interested in thinking about like far more interested in questions of, could we think of God's presence more broadly, for instance? Could we think of God dwelling with the people rather than being in a physical geographical location? Why would situations like that bring up questions like, does God save up consequences and then pour them out multiple generations down the road? Or does God somehow make sure that the consequences of our choices are experienced by those who make the choice? Okay, so there's a lively debate in the Hebrew Bible about whether the one who sins is the one who dies, or whether the children of the children's children are going to suffer the consequences of what the parents did. And so I'm asking my students to engage in nuanced conversations, to embrace paradox, to hold space for things that at first glance might seem like a paradox, right? To be mutually exclusive, but really are part of this very dynamic conversation that we as readers are invited into. And I realized, you know what? It's not actually possible for them to do that kind of engagement if their survival, right, their threat response has been activated. That part of their processing is simply not available. And so this made me start thinking about the importance of bearing witness. I really like this this word, and I know it has mixed connotations in Seventh-day Adventist circles. I know I graduated from college with a whole lot of lists of like books that had formulas for how to say the perfect thing to convince someone over tea to become a Christian so that they would be right with God. But I appreciate, again, I'm coming from a Hebrew Bible perspective, so I appreciate the wisdom that I'm finding in Jewish scholars and their engagement with this idea in the Hebrew Bible. Jonathan Sacks points out that witnessing each other is not for the sake of converting, but it is for the sake of things like calling forth the image of God in each other, that when we really see and hear and understand each other, we are calling forth the image of God in each other. he also talks about how the entire Hebrew Bible, in a way, is an ongoing wrestling with the question of how do we engage with each other in a way that both respects our own freedom and dignity, and also that of the other. If you're familiar with Martin Buber, the idea of I, thou, not objectifying fellow human beings. And so in the Hebrew Bible, this idea of bearing witness, for me, it comes from we could look in a lot of places, but I'm thinking specifically of the opening verses of the book of Exodus, which we all had to type in as our password, right, to enter this meeting. But that book starts out with this fascinating depiction of God, quite anthropomorphic. God is described in terms of human terms. God is described as looking down and seeing the people, right, who are in bondage. He sees their oppression. He hears their cries, and he knows them. In Hebrew, the word know can mean anything from knowing something intellectually to intimacy on the level of husband and wife, to, I think, many translations in those opening parts of the book of Exodus translate it as God saw, God heard, and God was concerned about the people. And I often insert the word compassionate here. I've been doing a lot of research on compassion the last few years, and one of the elements of the idea of compassion that I appreciate is that compassion is not just being aware of someone else. So there's a difference, right? Empathy maybe could be conceptualized as sort of an ability to listen, to see, to be aware of another person's experience. But compassion also involves a response. And this is how bearing witness is depicted in the Bible, that God sees and hears and is concerned for or has understanding, and that leads to action. And so the idea of bearing witness to me has become really, really important. And I think going back to standing in front of these classrooms of students and recognizing that the wounds that they carry could actually be barriers to the kind of learning that I hope to facilitate, I've started to think of bearing witness as something that can be an antidote to wounds. I can give you some examples of people who are thinking about this in really beautiful ways. Bessel van der Kolk, who is most famous, I think, for his book, The Body Keeps the Score. He writes that trauma is when we are not seen and known. So in other words, not seeing each other, not being seen and known, not having the capacity to be present with, to hear and see and understand our fellow humans is part of what causes that wounding, right? The trauma that is not what happens to us, but the disintegration, the fragmentation, the breaking of relationships with ourselves, others, the created world, and the divine. So for this reason, I'm more and more convinced all the time that bearing witness is a way to invest in healing. In a book that just came out, I think last week, Caitlin Curtis, in the book Living Resistance, writes that when we slow down and engage in the work of storytelling and story sharing, something sacred happens every single time. So I want to say a few things about particular things that I think are challenges for us. I don't want to make assumptions for everyone here, but I know I am living and working within a religious community, and there are certain things that I pick up sometimes just by a feeling in the air, sometimes from implied comments that are not said directly, and sometimes I pick them up explicitly. But there are challenges to committing to bearing witness and to prioritizing healing over conveying information. So one of the challenges that I have noticed is that I don't want to use the word we. I think for many people, something in our story or background has caused us to couple, like to overlap. Imagine two circles overlapping: identity and then the impact that we have in the world. Okay. And they become linked like this. And I'll just give you an example. I've noticed that if I bring up a conversation around how sometimes what we do in our classrooms here at Walla Walla, at this place where we are working within a system that requires a tremendous amount of religious studies, like every student takes 18 credits of religion classes, which I'm not discounting that. I'm grateful that I have employment. And that system is what creates a place for me to have these conversations with students. But the idea that if we say something in our classrooms that causes harm, that acknowledging that harm somehow means that we are a bad person. Okay, so coupling, so this overlap where who a person is and how they are received or their work is experienced in the world is the same thing. And so to say that some sort of harm has happened is to say that the person is bad or doing bad work. And when those two things are coupled together, it seems to me that it makes conversation very difficult along these lines. It makes it very difficult for people to hear stories of other real human beings. And so I think that one of the challenges before us is to uncouple identity from how our work is received in the world, because I think that could open a way for us to enter into a dynamic process, which I understand is frightening because our brains we're pattern-seeking creatures, right? We need predictability, and there is only a limited amount of predictability when you enter into dynamic relationship with other beings, right? Because you're not in control of the relationship that's being created. You're only one part of it, and it's being shaped by others as well. And I understand that there is a certain level of fear because we can only handle a certain amount of uncertainty. But I think that we have work to do, that we can move forward in small ways of uncoupling our sense of self from the impact that our work has, and thereby making it possible not to need to flee if someone says such and such was hurtful to me, that we can stay there and hear about it and ask questions and be curious, rather than needing to run away or needing to decide who's bad. And because it can't be us, needing to say that the person acknowledging harm is the person who is bad. So I think that this is one of the challenges that we face in religious communities of building our capacity to do that. I also think that it is, like I said, because of our need for certainty and predictability, it's a challenge to stay engaged in dynamic processes. I like to say that every relational space that we enter is co-created. So I believe God invites us to co-create relational space between the human and divine realms. And I think that God is quite delighted in allowing the entire range of human experience and humanity to be in that partnership, and quite comfortable with the dynamic unfolding process that entails. And I think that the idea of recognizing our own limitations can be helpful in this. So I might realize, oh, I've reached my limit. I really need to back away and be in a place that's predictable and feels safer to me. That's perfectly fine. But then to be able to re-engage, to re-enter that co-created relational space. Whenever I think about the Hebrew Bible story, it's also at the beginning of the book of Genesis, but a little bit later in chapter 3, God talks from the bush that is on fire but is not consumed, and Moses is saying, well, I can't go and tell them this because they're going to ask who sent me, and I'm not going to know what to say. And so God says, well, tell them the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob sent you. And he's like, oh no, I'm going to need to say more than that. Who really, like, who should I say sent me? And God says, I will be who I will be. In other words, no human tidbit of language will ever be able to nail down who God is. And yet that I will be who I will be desires to journey with humans, right? And so we could find ourselves in situations where it's not easy to stay engaged. But I think that in the Hebrew Bible, we find an invitation to then re-engage after we take whatever break that we need to re-engage. And then the last thing that I think is a challenge for us is that we really need to reckon with our conception of violence. I don't know exactly how to broach this topic, but I guess I will try to generalize an example enough that I can share how this manifests. There's conversation, and I think rather heated debate around the topic of whether words can be violent. Some people say, well, if you say that I can hurt you by my words, that I can commit violence against you by my words, then you are cheapening the word violence, because violence means physical, like, destruction, right? So if you hit me over the head with a club and there's blood coming out of my nose and I fall to the ground, that counts as violence. But you telling me that I now no longer belong to this family because I'm an abomination, that does not count as violence. Okay? And I've noticed this pop up in, frankly, incredibly troubling ways. One example is a few years back, I was trying in my own feeble and I'm not really trained in this area, but I was trying to advocate for a couple of women who had come and shared with me domestic abuse. And as I was trying to locate resources for them, something troubling came into my awareness, and that was people would ask, well, oh, so this person that you want to support was raped by her husband. Well, was that like recently, or was that a long time ago? As if it was a long time ago, it didn't count anymore. Or people would say things like, oh, I might have a car or, an apartment that I could like make available to this person, but like, are they still being beaten right now? Or are they just being spoken to rudely, right? As if this was as if physically beating someone down to the ground it counted as violence, but right? Most emotional abuse is in the realm of verbal expression, and that somehow doesn't count. And so I think that one of the challenges facing us in learning to bear witness to spiritual harm and religious trauma is that we must reckon with our conception of violence. We must find ways to talk about this. And personally, I think that until we can think of relational violence as something that counts, whether or not there's a physical component or not, that we're not going to be able to effectively bear witness. We can't, there's no both and. But this, I'm open to conversation about this. The last thing I want to share with you is I've spent the last couple of months kind of doing a pilot group, opening a space for students to process religious trauma. And I just wanted to share the framework that I'm using for that group. I ended up using a 5 cornerstones of optimal well-being from Dr. Andrea Pennington. I just found her sort of framework to be really simple and applicable, and it was something that I could adapt. So depending on the students that I was working with, I could draw on different examples. So that these 5 facets for me are different aspects of kind of how I'm conceptualizing creating a container for the story telling and story sharing, and for bearing compassionate witness to each other's stories. And yeah, I'm happy to share more about this, but I just wanted to share sort of a very brief framework. Basically, we try to sit down together and to process together, and there's lots of choice given. Again, people who are survivors of trauma really need a sense of agency, because one of the common things in stories of trauma is like boundary violation, or like if you look at a whole list of definitions of spiritual abuse, for instance, almost every single one includes something about control or manipulation. And so I try to use this framework and to create space where there's continual reminders that everybody can take ownership of their own journey. People can talk about their actual stories, or people can just talk about what it's like for them to actually be in that space processing together. They don't have to share anything of their actual experience. And we sort of practice a way of being together. This I wonder if I can show you. This is, I don't know if you can see this, but I have this sign that says speaker, and I've taped it to a ruler, and we actually physically pass this around, because as nice and flowery and beautiful as the term compassionate witnessing sounds, it's not natural at all. And it involves holding non-judgmental space for other people's experiences, and that involves, approaching people's stories with curiosity, but not only toward the person you're listening to, but also toward you. So as someone is talking, what comes up for you? What terms that they say particularly resonate with you? But when you share that, when you notice what resonates with you, the challenge that I'm trying to address by having this speaker sign is to say, we can say, wow, when you used the word fragility, it really resonated with me. but we don't then launch into our own story, right? So we're aware of our own reactions and responses to the person that we are bearing witness to their experience, but we also stay cognizant of who is the speaker, who's in a listening role or a witnessing role. And we do that by thinking of this compassionate witnessing as an awareness of ourselves and of the other person. And yeah, it's not automatic, but it is, I think, a skill that we can learn to listen well, to hold space for each other. And I think healing can happen in those spaces. I also acknowledge that entering those spaces is inherently risky in some ways. I'll close with just a couple of words about opportunities. I see a number of opportunities. In compassion research, there's a lot of observation that we can actually build our capacity to be present with suffering, our own and that of others. There's even a movement that I've really been moved and blessed by, that is working toward building capacity for global social witnessing. So the idea, we can build our capacity to hold space for what we see. We're not, I think our nervous systems are not meant to be able to access the tragedy in Turkey on our little phone device, right? We're not built to cope well with having at our fingertips the tragedies from around the world. But since that's our new reality, we can start to build capacity for bearing witness to suffering, our own and that of others. And that is work that we can invest in. I also think that we have a responsibility to quote unquote expand the circle. As long as we're dehumanizing others in order to make ourselves feel okay, it's not going to be possible to bear compassionate witness to someone that we have placed outside the circle, right? That we consider out there while we're in here. And so we have to reckon with that. And we need to, if we want, right? Maybe not everyone is needing or wanting to be engaged in the work of bearing witness, but if we do, we need to really expand the circle. And then we need to hold doctrine loosely enough to prioritize relational well-being. And I will just let that line speak for itself. I have a short list here of things that you might find helpful if you are interested in reading more. If you want to take a screenshot of this, I'm going to unshare my screen. You're also welcome to email me at compassionatewholeness@gmail.com, and I'm happy to send you journal article links and other things that I have found helpful in engaging in this conversation. All right, I think it is time for us to engage back and forth. I'm excited about this, and I look forward to hearing thoughts, perspectives. There are a lot of great questions that came up in the chat, and I look forward to maybe having a sort of a hive mind, right? Bringing together our collective wisdom that is gathered here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Washburn. Thank you so much for being open and being vulnerable and sharing with us. Guys, now it's the